Hi everyone, welcome to my channel Bytes and Bolts, where technology and DIY come together. Today I'm going to be discussing my build here, the cased Retropie. We're going to go over the materials used to build the system, as well as the components that make up the system. I'm also going to be going over some of the techniques I had to use, some of the creative ways I had to get the case to come together. Namely, the screen was the most difficult part. We'll get into that more in a little bit. Before we get started though, let me just explain, this is going to need to be a two-part video due to the details that I need to go into, and as well as the history of improving the case. So make sure you subscribe to my channel if you want to see part 2 of this video. Okay, so here you can see my conceptual layout of the cased Retropie. This was in its early stages. I had just purchased all the parts and the case. It took me 2 attempts to find the case that was the size that I felt was ideal for what I was trying to do. The first case I got, it was much bigger. It just looked too big and bulky. So I ended up returning that, getting this case here. This is it's a 16-inch case, so it's about 16 inches wide. I think it's about 11 inches tall, 10 inches tall, something like that. So once I got the case, the first thing I wanted to do was lay everything out and get a concept of how everything would fit in the case. So here are some of the components for my initial build. You can see I've got the Raspberry Pi down on the bottom right. I have a power bank on the bottom left, an LCD controller board, the LCD screen which will mount in the lid. I've got a controller hooked up, as well as some of the cabling and everything. I've got some speakers down there that I intended on mounting to have sound for the system, because what good is a game system without sound? And I have to say, this initial layout looks pretty good. However, once you get to building this stuff, you will make tweaks and changes, and everything will end up looking completely different than the way you initially laid it out. And you'll see these changes coming as I move along. So once I got the case laid out and understood where everything needed to be, my next challenge was actually mounting the screen in the lid. As you can see, this is a bare laptop screen. I pulled it out of an old laptop. I think this is a 14-inch screen that I used initially, and mounting the screen in here was presenting a challenge because obviously the lid of the box is much larger than the screen itself, and there's padding in the back, which isn't a big deal. It adds some cushion, which is nice. But my challenge was, how was I going to get the screen to mount in there centered and have a bezel or something around it to give it a more finished look? So I did a lot of brainstorming in this stage, trying to figure out what I could do to make this work. And what I came up with was to sandwich the monitor between some foam craft board and what I would call poster board. It's a corrugated plastic that's used for yard sale signs and stuff like that. It's got 2 layers with it's an air gap in between. So I started working on mounting the screen by first taking some foam board and cutting it to the size of the inside of the lid of the case. Once I did that, I traced around the screen and created a cutout in the foam board. Once I finished mounting the screen in the foam inset, I worked on the corrugated plastic to cut out a bezel that would sit on top of the screen and create a nice finished look. I also cut some speaker holes in this bezel for little 1-inch speakers that would mount inside the bezel and face directly towards you while you were engaging in gameplay. Here you can see the bezel mounted on top of the screen once I got everything cut out to size. As you can see, the edges are a little bit rough, but the nice thing about the case being foam on the inside is that these little mistakes are easily covered up by pressing it into the nooks and crannies. Once the screen assembly was fully assembled, I test fit it inside the lid to see how it looks, and this is the result. You can see that I've got a little bit of work to do on my trimming of the edges and trimming of the inside of the bezel, but for the most part, it definitely looks usable. After I mounted the screen and test fit everything and was satisfied, I moved on to mounting the components on the inside of the case. I didn't want to drill into the case itself, so what I opted to do was use some more of that corrugated plastic to mount the components and seat down inside the bottom of the case. I also wanted to make sure that I had room to fit the controllers in the case so that everything would be carried as one unit. So as you see from my initial layout, I shifted things to allow a better fit for everything, including the controllers. Now it was time to start giving everything a finished look. I found some carbon fiber tape on Amazon and decided that that would make a great cover that would go along with the color theme of the case. You can also see that I'm not very good at working with vinyl. You can see the bubbles and the raised portions around the bezel of the screen. But overall, once it sits inside, it doesn't look too bad. Here's the screen mounted once I put the carbon fiber tape on. After I finished that, I started adding some stickers to give it some flair. Later on in the build, I ended up removing the majority of these stickers because I think it just looked too cluttered. But when I first started, I thought it would give it a nostalgic feel, and I went pretty crazy with the sticker applications. Okay, and here we have some extra details here. One thing that I did to this case was I wanted to add external USB ports because when I first built this case, I used wired controllers. So I wanted a way to open the case up and be able to connect the controllers from the outside of the case instead of fiddling with plugging the controllers directly into the Raspberry Pi. I also wanted to make sure that the components and controllers were completely covered once this build was done. So I added a lid to the top of the case to give it an even more finished look. The lid hinges open from the right hand side, and the way I made this hinge open was to take the underside and cut a slot open in between the gaps of the corrugations. Once I did that, I added some mailing tape to the top of the bend to give it some additional strength. Once I finished the lid and the hinge, I went ahead and covered the lid with the carbon fiber tape to add to the finished effect. I also added a piece of foam on the underside of the lid that helps hold the controllers in place when the case is closed and in transit. Then I went ahead and added some more stickers to finish out the look. Okay, now to cover some flaws that were discovered after building the system initially. One of the major flaws was that you had to lift the lid completely up in order to power on the system. This completely defeated the purpose of having the lid hinged to access the controllers. In addition, it didn't make any sense to not be able to power the system externally through a switch. Hey everybody, we're back. So there is one other deficiency that I'd like to discuss, and that has to do with this USB port here. This is a 5 volt to 12 volt step up transformer. This is what I used to increase the power output for the screen since it required 12 volts. The problem with this is that going from 5 volts to 12 volts and the amps that the screen drew, it caused us to overheat. So what would happen is during intensive gameplay, when more wattage was being pulled from the system or from the battery, this piece would get too hot and it would shut the screen off temporarily. And then it would last for probably anywhere from 3 to 6 seconds, and then the screen would come back on. Obviously that's a serious issue when you're in the middle of playing a game. So I had to come up with another solution, and that's something we'll discuss in part 2 of this video series. So this is one of the deficiencies of this system behind me that I had to fix in order to move on and make the system even better than it was when I first envisioned it. Other than that, some other things to discuss regarding the system is the playtime. How many hours does this thing get? Even with the initial setup, I was getting probably about 4. I think I ran it nonstop one time, and I think I got about 4 to 4.5 hours out of it, and that was on a 10,000 milliamp hour Anchor battery pack, 5-volt battery pack. Not bad for a system of this size to take somewhere. Completely portable, carry it wherever you want to, set it up on a tabletop, set it up in a bar, anywhere. You could take it to a restaurant, I guess. I've wanted to, but the clutter on a restaurant table is probably not the best environment for a system like this. But there's other places that you can take it to in public, and you can play it, and it's a ton of fun to do. But we'll discuss some of the other changes that I've made to it in the next video, and we'll go over the improvements and what the system is now. So that wraps up this video for now. I hope that you'll stick around for part 2. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing if you want to see more content like this. Thank you.